18-year-old Liam sits in the back of a police cruiser. He isn't crying, and he isn't shaking. Instead, he is smirking. He has the soft features of an 8th grader wearing a branded hoodie. He sits there, utterly convinced that his age and intellect make him immune to the law. He thinks he has committed the perfect crime. But he doesn't know the hallway security camera captured the reflection of his phone screen in the mirror. A glowing digital confession. Liam acted completely untouchable. Then, a veteran judge with zero tolerance for teenage narcissism took the bench. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. Just 24 hours before the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, the neighborhood was bathed in the warm, golden-hour sunlight of a seemingly perfect afternoon. Oak Creek was the kind of place defined by manicured lawns, the smell of fresh mulch, and children riding bikes. It was a community where people felt so safe that doors were left unlocked. Living in one of these quiet suburban homes was Sarah, a 39-year-old dedicated single mother and pediatric nurse who was universally loved by her neighbors. Her absolute devotion was entirely focused on her son, Liam. She worked double shifts to afford his private schooling and gaming equipment. To the outside world, he was her entire universe. But behind his locked bedroom door, a dark shift in his behavior was already taking root. He thought he'd never be caught, but he was severely mistaken. Oak Creek was the picture of suburban tranquility, a haven where families moved to escape the unpredictable chaos of the city. It was the kind of neighborhood where front doors were casually left unlocked, and the scent of fresh mulch lingered in the warm afternoon air. Children rode their bicycles down the winding, tree-lined streets until the streetlights flickered on, signaling it was time to head home. At the heart of this idyllic community lived 39-year-old Sarah, a woman whose entire existence was defined by her boundless compassion and unwavering work ethic. As a pediatric nurse, she spent her days caring for the most vulnerable, earning a reputation as someone who would readily give you the shirt off her back. Universally loved by her neighbors, she was the first to organize a meal train for a sick friend, or offer a comforting shoulder in times of need. But Sarah's true dedication, her absolute and unwavering devotion, was reserved entirely for her teenage son, Liam. As a single mother, she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, determined to give him a life completely insulated from hardship. She routinely worked grueling double shifts at the hospital, sacrificing her own rest and well-being to afford his expensive private schooling and top-tier gaming equipment. To her family, her motivation was never a secret. As one relative would later recall with profound heartbreak, she breathed for that boy, and he was her entire universe. Every decision she made, every single hour of overtime she picked up, was a calculated investment in his future and his ultimate happiness. Despite her endless sacrifices, a subtle, dark shadow had begun to creep over their quiet household in the months leading up to that fateful night. Liam's demeanor started to shift in ways that were difficult to pinpoint at first, manifesting as a chilling withdrawal from the life Sarah had built for him. The once open relationship they shared was suddenly replaced by the heavy, impenetrable barrier of a constantly locked bedroom door. Sarah dismissed it as typical teenage angst, a phase of rebellion that all adolescents inevitably pass through. She rationalized his distance, telling herself that the intense pressure of his private school curriculum and the immersive, isolating world of online gaming were simply demanding more of his time and attention. However, the psychological changes went far deeper than mere teenage isolation. There was a sudden, chilling lack of empathy that began to seep through the cracks of his carefully maintained facade. Neighbors occasionally noticed a troubling coldness in his eyes, especially during moments that would typically elicit compassion, such as a complete and total indifference toward injured animals found near their property. He operated with an eerie detachment, viewing the world not as a community of living, breathing beings, but as a series of obstacles and annoyances standing in his way. Yet to Sarah, Blinded by the unconditional protective love of a mother, these glaring red flags were invisible. She only saw the sweet boy she had raised, completely unaware of the absolute darkness taking root just down the hall. The evening the tragedy unfolded began like countless others, cloaked in the comforting, mundane routine of suburban life. It was the calm before the storm, a quiet Tuesday night where nothing felt out of the ordinary. Sarah was in the kitchen, meticulously preparing dinner after a long, exhausting shift at the clinic. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the comforting aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the lower level of the house. In the background, the television murmured quietly, casting a soft, flickering glow across the living room. It was a picture of perfect domestic tranquility, the exact kind of peaceful environment Sarah had worked so tirelessly to provide for her son. Upstairs, the heavy silence of Liam's room stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the kitchen below. As the dinner finished cooking, Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel and made her way toward the staircase. She took a deep breath, the physical exhaustion of the day momentarily fading as she anticipated spending a quiet, connected evening with her son. She called out his name, but there was no response, only the muffled electronic sounds of a video game bleeding through the floorboards. Assuming he simply hadn't heard her over the noise of his headset, she began her ascent. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet, a familiar, comforting sound in the aging suburban home. With every step Sarah took toward the second floor, the illusion of their perfect, safe life drew closer to its violent end. She reached the landing and walked toward the locked door, unaware that the boy waiting on the other side had already made a calculated, irreversible decision. The warmth of the home was about to be shattered by an act of unimaginable betrayal. She knocked gently, her voice echoing softly in the quiet hallway as she called him down for dinner. It was a simple, loving request from a mother who had given him absolutely everything. But as she turned the handle and stepped into the room, the trajectory of both their lives was permanently severed. It is the last time she will ever be heard alive. The tranquility of Oak Creek was shattered not by a scream, but by a sudden, heavy thud that resonated through the thin walls of the neighboring house. A neighbor, who had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the evening, immediately felt a surge of unease. They described the sound as something far more substantial than a dropped book or a falling chair. It was a final, chilling impact followed by an eerie, absolute silence. Fearing the worst for the dedicated nurse next door, the neighbor dialed 911 with trembling hands. First responders arrived within minutes, their sirens muted as they navigated the dark driveway, stepping into a house that felt unnaturally still. As the lead officers crossed the threshold, the warm, inviting atmosphere Sarah had cultivated was immediately replaced by a thick, oppressive dread. The air inside the home didn't smell like the dinner Sarah had been preparing. Instead, it was heavy with the unmistakable, metallic scent of copper. The suffocating silence of the house seemed to press against the officers' ears as they began their sweep of the ground floor. Every room was perfectly in place, the television still murmuring to an empty living room, creating a haunting juxtaposition between the mundane reality of suburban life and the invisible horror that was beginning to seep through the walls. Moving toward the staircase, the officers passed a gallery of family photos that lined the hallway. These images captured a lifetime of Sarah's devotion: Liam as a toddler, Liam at his first baseball game, and a particularly poignant shot of the boy smiling with missing front teeth. These frozen moments of innocence stood in stark, jarring contrast to the grim reality the police were about to encounter. The house, which should have been a sanctuary of memories, had been transformed into a cold, clinical puzzle. As they climbed the stairs, the creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning, leading them directly toward the source of the metallic scent and the unimaginable brutality that waited in the master bedroom. Nothing could have prepared the seasoned responders for the scene they discovered upstairs. Sarah was found in a state that defied the typical logic of a domestic dispute. The brutality of the attack was staggering and highly disproportionate to any common conflict. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a total erasure of a human being. The sheer ferocity used against a woman who had spent her life caring for others left the investigators in a state of stunned disbelief.
The room, once a place of rest, had become a testament to a rage that was as calculated as it was overwhelming, marking a clear departure from any accidental or heat-of-the-moment tragedy. Upon securing the room, the detectives noticed a series of chilling anomalies that immediately complicated the investigation. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no jimmied locks,
and no disrupted window screens. The killer hadn't broken in. They had been welcomed into the most private areas of the home. Even more disturbing was the discovery of the murder weapon, a heavy kitchen knife that had been meticulously wiped clean of any obvious gore. It hadn't been discarded in a panic. It was left conspicuously on the nightstand, placed with a precision that suggested a cold, methodical conclusion to the act. This wasn't the work of a disorganized intruder. As the reality of Sarah's death set in, a new wave of panic swept through the scene. Where was the boy? Seeing the empty bedroom and the lack of Liam's presence, the officer's initial instinct was to assume he had been kidnapped by the same monster who killed his mother. A frantic search of the property began, and back at the precinct, officials were already drafting an Amber Alert, fearing every second that passed put the 14-year-old in more danger. The narrative in those first 30 minutes was one of double tragedy, a mother lost and a child stolen, leaving the first responders desperate to find any trace of the boy before he met a similar fate. The search ended abruptly when an officer, patrolling the perimeter of the neighborhood, spotted a familiar figure walking casually down the street. It was Liam. He was several blocks away from his home, appearing entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding just behind him. In his hand, he held a frozen drink from a nearby convenience store, sipping it with the nonchalance of a teenager on a summer break. When the officer approached him, the boy didn't offer a single question about his mother or why police cars were surrounding his house. He stood there in the cool night air, his expression blank and his pulse steady, already beginning the performance of an untouchable victim. This chilling lack of reaction sent an immediate shiver down the spine of the veteran officer. In a situation where any other child would be hysterical with fear or confusion, Liam remained eerily composed. He didn't ask if his mother was okay, nor did he seem surprised to see the flashing lights reflecting in his eyes. He just stood there with his frozen drink, a 14-year-old boy who seemed to have disconnected himself from the world of human emotion. As he was led toward the police cruiser, the smirk he had been hiding began to flicker at the corners of his mouth, a silent signal that the true nightmare of Oak Creek was only just beginning. Liam began his performance the moment he entered the precinct, painting a vivid picture of a mysterious intruder who had breached the sanctity of his home while he was out. He spoke with a practiced, almost cinematic cadence, detailing his supposed fear and the shock of returning to such horror. However, the detectives watching through the one-way glass noticed something physically impossible. His heart rate, monitored by the quiet sensors in the room, remained eerily steady throughout the entire ordeal. This total lack of physiological stress was the first major crack in his narrative. He wasn't relaying a trauma. He was reciting a script he had written for himself. The interrogation room was a stark, unforgiving space, bathed in the harsh, flickering glow of overhead fluorescent lighting that seemed to strip away any sense of comfort. Liam sat in the center of the room, his small frame dwarfed by the heavy metal chair, but his posture betrayed a shocking lack of distress. He sat with his legs crossed, slouching back with an air of casual indifference that was entirely inappropriate for a teenager whose mother had just been murdered. There was no trembling and no frantic searching for answers. He looked around the clinical environment with a detached, almost bored curiosity, as if he were waiting for a school assembly to begin. When the detectives began to press for more details about his timeline, Liam realized his calm demeanor might be working against him, and he attempted to shift gears. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a series of high-pitched wails that were intended to signal a total emotional breakdown. Yet, as the detectives leaned in, they noticed a glaring and damning problem. Despite the loud sobbing sounds, there was a complete absence of actual tears on his cheeks. It was a hollow, theatrical performance. Between his rehearsed gasps for air, he subtly spread his fingers, peeking through them to gauge the detective's reactions and see if they were falling for his manipulation. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly heavy as the investigators let a long, tactical silence hang between them. The only sound in the small space was the persistent, mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit, vibrating against the walls in a rhythmic drone. One of the detectives began tapping his pen slowly against the wooden table, a sound that would typically grate on the nerves of a guilty suspect. Liam, however, remained completely unfazed, his breathing remaining deep and rhythmic. They continued to analyze his vitals, noting the total absence of the jagged, shallow breaths that naturally accompany genuine grief or the terror of a child who has lost everything. The lead detective finally broke the silence, laying out a physical map of the neighborhood and comparing it to the boy's story. Liam claimed he had been at the convenience store during the window of the attack, but the timeline he provided simply did not align with the neighbor's 911 call. The gap was far too narrow for an external intruder to have entered, committed such a complex crime, and vanished without a trace before Liam returned. The detective leaned over the table, pointing out that for his version of events to be true, a phantom killer would have had to be invisible to every camera and witness in Oak Creek. As the questioning continued, the investigators turned their attention to Liam's physical appearance, which seemed far too pristine given the circumstances. He was wearing a brand new outfit, looking remarkably clean for someone who had allegedly just spent the evening in a house where a violent struggle had occurred. When a secondary team was dispatched back to the suburban home, they discovered that the laundry basket in the hallway was suspiciously empty, and the washing machine was still warm. It appeared as though the entire house had been scrubbed of its most recent history, leaving the boy standing in the precinct in clothes that hadn't even seen a single day of normal wear. Just as Liam began to stammer out a new explanation for his wardrobe change, the lead detective's phone buzzed sharply on the table. It was the forensics team still processing the master bedroom. They reported that they had found absolutely no evidence of an intruder, no foreign DNA, no unknown fingerprints, and no sign of a forced entry anywhere on the property. However, the technician's voice grew hushed as he informed the detective that they had discovered something else entirely. Tucked deep inside the metal slats of the bedroom's air vent, they found a hidden bundle that Liam had clearly tried to erase from existence. The detective ended the call and looked back at the boy, whose smirk had finally vanished, replaced by a look of cold, guarded calculation. The victim narrative was dead, and the investigation was shifting from a search for a phantom killer to a deep dive into the boy's own secret world. The hidden discovery in the vent was only the beginning of a digital and physical trail that would soon expose the true nature of the teenager sitting across from them. Liam thought he was the smartest person in the room, but he was about to learn that every calculation leaves a footprint, and his was starting to lead directly to a jail cell. The discovery inside the air vent changed the entire trajectory of the case, shifting the narrative from a desperate rescue mission to a cold, calculated homicide investigation. As the lead detective pulled a pair of blood-soaked socks from the metal slats in Liam's bedroom, the illusion of an outside intruder vanished. These were not the actions of a terrified child hiding from a monster. They were the actions of someone trying to erase the physical evidence of a crime. The metallic scent that had filled the house now had a direct link to the boy who sat so calmly in the interrogation room. With this physical proof in hand, the police no longer looked at Liam as a victim, but as the primary architect of the tragedy that had unfolded in the upstairs hallway. To truly understand the depth of the betrayal, investigators knew they had to look beyond the physical walls of the Oak Creek home and into the digital world Liam inhabited. Detectives quickly moved to secure warrants for every electronic device the teenager owned, seizing his smartphone, his laptop, and his high-end gaming console. They knew that in the modern age, a person's digital footprint often tells the truth that their words attempt to hide. While Liam sat in the precinct believing he had successfully covered his tracks, a team of forensic digital analysts began the painstaking process of extracting every byte of data from his devices. They were looking for the thoughts he hadn't spoken out loud, the plans he had whispered into the glow of a screen. What they found inside his search history was a chilling roadmap of premeditation that shattered any remaining sympathy for the boy.
Long before the first responders arrived, Liam's browser was filled with queries that revealed a dark, calculating mind. He had searched for how to clean blood from carpet and spent hours reading through juvenile sentencing laws in his specific state.
Perhaps most damning of all was a search conducted just days before the incident. Can you be tried as an adult at 14? This wasn't a sudden explosion of emotion or a temporary loss of control. It was a documented investigation into the consequences of a crime he was already planning to commit against his own mother. Liam's arrogance was his ultimate undoing, fueled by a misplaced confidence in his own technical superiority. He truly believed that by using incognito mode and deleting his history, he had made himself invisible to the law. He operated under the false assumption that clicking a delete button on an app meant the data was erased from existence, failing to realize that every action leaves a permanent mark on a server. This sense of being untouchable was a hallmark of his narcissism, leading him to believe he was smarter than the veteran investigators and forensic experts assigned to his case. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game where he held all the cards, but the digital breadcrumbs he left behind were about to form a mountain of evidence. The investigation soon pivoted to a private Discord server where Liam spent the majority of his free time away from the real world. Inside this digital community, he didn't hide his intentions. Instead, he used the anonymity of the internet to brag about his frustrations. Detectives uncovered a series of messages where Liam spoke to online friends about getting rid of a problem that was standing in the way of his freedom. He spoke of his mother not as a parent who loved him, but as a nuisance to be managed or eliminated. To his gaming friends, these comments might have seemed like edgy teenage posturing, but to the investigators, they were the clear and present evidence of a motive rooted in a disturbing lack of human empathy. The digital proof reached a crescendo when analysts recovered a text message sent exactly 5 minutes after the estimated time of the murder. While Sarah lay on the floor upstairs, her son had picked up his phone to send a final, chilling confirmation to a contact. The message was simple, devoid of any regret or panic. "It's done. I'm free." The timestamp of this message was a devastating blow to his defense, placing him at the scene and in possession of his phone at the exact moment he claimed to be at a convenience store. It was a digital confession, written in his own hand, proving that the murder was not a tragedy to him, but a successful transaction to gain the independence he craved. Despite the weight of the texts and the search history, the most damaging piece of evidence was not a string of words or a timestamp. As the cybercrimes unit dug deeper into his cloud backups, they realized Liam had succumbed to a fatal impulse that many narcissists share: the need to document his own perceived power. He hadn't just committed the act and sent a message, he had taken something with him, a digital trophy of the moment his life changed forever. It was a photograph he couldn't resist taking, a visual record of his transition from a suburban teenager to something far more sinister. This image, hidden deep within a deleted folder, would eventually become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, leaving the courtroom in a state of absolute moral shock. The investigation reached its darkest turning point when the cybercrimes unit successfully recovered a deleted image from the cloud. It was a piece of evidence so chilling that it momentarily silenced the entire precinct, revealing a level of depravity that surpassed anything the investigators had initially imagined. The image wasn't a mistake or an accidental capture. It was a deliberate digital souvenir of the most horrific moment of the boy's life. As the image flickered to life on the computer screen, the true nature of Liam's character was laid bare, showing that beneath his suburban, teenage exterior resided a mind that functioned with an almost alien level of emotional detachment. The file revealed a selfie that Liam had taken shortly after the incident, captured with the cold precision of someone documenting a trivial achievement. In the foreground of the photo, Liam is seen holding up a peace sign, his face composed in a calm, almost satisfied expression that betrayed no hint of the violence that had just occurred. But it was the background of the image that carried the most devastating weight. Blurred and out of focus, yet unmistakable to anyone who knew the house, Sarah lay on the floor behind him. He had used her final moments as a backdrop for a casual social media pose, proving that his mother's life meant less to him than a digital image. This single photograph provided the ultimate window into Liam's psychological profile, pointing toward a severe case of malignant narcissism. In Liam's distorted worldview, people were not individuals with their own feelings, dreams, or rights to exist. He didn't see his mother as a person who had nurtured him or sacrificed her own well-being to provide for his future. To him, she was merely an object in his environment, a character in a game that he had decided to write out of the script. This lack of basic human empathy was the foundation upon which he built his plan, allowing him to act without a single moment of hesitation or moral conflict. In his mind, Sarah had ceased to be a mother and had instead become a physical obstacle to his absolute freedom. He viewed her rules, her expectations, and even her presence as a direct infringement on his desire to do exactly as he pleased. The grounded gaming console, or the questions about his schoolwork, were not acts of parenting in his eyes, but intolerable acts of aggression that justified a permanent solution. He believed that by removing her, he would finally be the master of his own universe, free from the constraints of adult supervision and the reality of consequences. He saw himself as the hero of a story where the only rule was his own satisfaction. When the detectives finally confronted Liam with the recovered photo, they expected a breakdown, a confession, or perhaps even a flash of genuine fear. Instead, Liam didn't break down or show a single ounce of remorse for the image he had created. His reaction was one of profound entitlement and annoyance rather than guilt. Rather than addressing the horror in the background of the picture, he focused on a trivial grievance, complaining loudly that his phone had been confiscated in the first place. He was more upset about the loss of his digital connection to the world than he was about the loss of his mother's life, confirming the absolute void where his conscience should have been. This raises a chilling question for everyone following this story. Would you forgive them if you were the judge? It is a moment that forces us to grapple with the darkest aspects of human nature and the limitations of our legal system. How does society handle a monster with a child's face, a person who looks like an innocent student but thinks with the cold calculation of a predator? The case of Liam challenges the idea that youth is always a shield for ignorance or a lack of understanding. It forces us to ask if some individuals are simply born with a darkness that no amount of love or guidance can ever truly reach or rectify. With the selfie recovered and the digital trail fully exposed, the police finally had everything they needed to bring the investigation to a close. The complex web of lies Liam had spun was now completely dismantled by his own digital footprints. The trap that the detectives had meticulously set finally snapped shut, leaving the teenager with no more excuses and no more room to manipulate the narrative. There were no more mysterious intruders or missing timelines to debate. The evidence was physical, digital, and undeniable, moving the case from the quiet interrogation rooms of the precinct toward the public spectacle of the courtroom. The silence of the hallway was broken by the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around small, slender wrists. For the first time, the reality of the situation seemed to penetrate Liam's shield of arrogance. He had operated for weeks under the delusion that his age and his perceived intelligence made him completely untouchable by the systems of adult justice. He thought he'd never be caught, believing that he was several steps ahead of every adult in his life. He was wrong. As he was led away, the smirk that had defined his demeanor began to waver, replaced by the first shadows of a consequence he had never truly believed would arrive. The morning of the trial arrived with an intensity that Oak Creek had never seen before. Outside the courthouse, a media circus had formed, with flashbulbs popping incessantly as journalists from across the country converged on the small town. The courtroom was packed to capacity, every wooden bench filled with onlookers and reporters eager to see the face of the boy behind the headlines. There was a jarring contrast between the heavy, ancient oak doors of the chamber and the small, slight boy who walked through them. This wasn't just another juvenile hearing. It was a theater of justice, where the weight of the law was about to descend upon a child who believed he was beyond its reach. The atmosphere in the room shifted from curiosity to a heavy, legal gravity when the charges were formally read. In an unprecedented move that sent shockwaves through the community, the state announced they were charging the 14-year-old Liam as an adult. This decision wasn't made lightly. It reflected the sheer calculation and brutality found in the evidence. By stripping away the protections typically afforded to minors, the prosecution was signaling that age would not be a shield for the monstrous act committed in that upstairs bedroom. Liam was no longer just a wayward teenager in the eyes of the law. He was a defendant facing the full, terrifying power of the adult criminal justice system. Presiding over this high-stakes trial was Judge Harrison, a man whose reputation for being a no-nonsense, stern jurist preceded him. Having spent decades on the bench, he had seen the very darkest sides of humanity and was not easily swayed by theatrical displays or youthful appearances. When he entered the room, he commanded immediate silence, his presence alone tempering the frantic energy of the media. Judge Harrison's eyes were sharp, reflecting a lifetime of discerning truth from lies, and as he looked down at the young defendant, it was clear that the untouchable status Liam had cultivated was about to be put to its ultimate test in a room where authority was absolute. Liam sat at the defense table, looking almost comical in an oversized suit that seemed designed to make him appear smaller and more vulnerable than he truly was. However, any illusion of innocence was quickly dispelled by his shocking demeanor during the opening statements. While the prosecutor detailed the final moments of his mother's life, Liam let out a long, audible yawn, stretching his arms as if he were sitting through a boring classroom lecture. He began to idly spin in his leather chair, his eyes wandering toward the ceiling, showing a level of disrespect that left the gallery in stunned silence. He was treating the most serious moment of his life like a trivial inconvenience. Just a few feet away, the emotional toll of the tragedy was on full display. Sarah's sister sat in the front row, her body shaking with grief as she sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. She represented a family that had been utterly destroyed by a boy they had once loved and nurtured. The sound of her weeping filled the gaps in the legal arguments, a constant reminder of the human cost of Liam's cold-blooded ambition. Every person in the room could feel the weight of her agony, except for the one person responsible for it. The disconnect between the victim's family and the defendant was a chasm that no suit or legal strategy could ever hope to bridge. Rather than showing a shred of empathy for his aunt's visible pain, Liam looked over at her and rolled his eyes with an air of pure annoyance. To him, her grief was nothing more than an irritant, a performance that was slowing down the proceedings. He leaned in close to his defense attorney, his voice a hushed but audible whisper that was captured by the sensitive courtroom microphones. "They can't touch me," he muttered with a smirk that chilled those who heard it. "I'm a minor." It was the ultimate expression of his narcissism, a belief that a simple biological fact would grant him a permanent pass for the most heinous of crimes. The trial was moving from procedural formalities into the heart of the prosecution's evidence, and the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The lead prosecutor stood up, adjusting his glasses as he prepared to dismantle the boy's invincible illusion piece by piece. He didn't look at the defense table. He looked directly at the jury, promising them that the truth would be found not in Liam's age, but in his actions. As he called his first witness to the stand, the courtroom held its collective breath, ready to see the facade of the untouchable teenager finally begin to crumble under the weight of the law. The battle for justice had truly begun. As the defense team began their presentation, it became clear that their strategy would rely heavily on shifting the blame away from Liam's character and toward external influences. They attempted to paint the 14-year-old not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a tragic victim of a severe video game addiction that had supposedly blurred his reality. His lawyers argued that he had existed in a snapped mental state, where the lines between virtual violence and the real world had become indistinguishable. It was a calculated attempt to pathologize his actions, suggesting that he wasn't truly responsible for the choices he made, but was instead a byproduct of a digital environment that his young brain simply couldn't handle. To bolster this narrative, the defense called a hired psychologist to the stand, who delivered a lengthy testimony on the biological limitations of the adolescent mind. The expert witness claimed that Liam's prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for decision-making and understanding consequences,
was not developed enough for him to truly grasp the finality of death. The testimony painted a picture of a child acting on primitive impulses, devoid of the capacity for long-term planning or malice. It was a classic, diminished capacity defense, designed to evoke sympathy from the jury by framing the murder as a biological inevitability rather than a conscious choice made by a calculating individual. Under the careful instruction of his legal team, Liam finally attempted to alter his defiant demeanor, moving from arrogance into a staged display of contrition. He sat with his head bowed low, his small frame hunched over as if he were finally feeling the weight of the proceedings. For the first time in the trial, he tried to look sad, occasionally rubbing his eyes as if to suggest tears that still refused to fall. It was a jarring shift from the boy who had been yawning and spinning in his chair just hours earlier. This new performance was a desperate attempt to align his physical appearance with the defense's narrative of a confused and overwhelmed child. As the psychologist continued to drone on about brain development,
Liam occupied himself by idly tracing intricate patterns on the wooden surface of the defense desk with his fingernail. Even in his attempt to appear remorseful, his underlying boredom and detachment were visible to those paying close attention. He wasn't listening to the testimony about his own mind. He was merely waiting for his part in the scene to be over. This quiet, repetitive motion was a telltale sign of his continued disconnect from the gravity of the situation, a subtle reminder that the sad child the defense was presenting was nothing more than a carefully crafted mask. The prosecution, however, was not about to let the snapped narrative go unchallenged, and they moved aggressively to tear down the defense's charade. During a fierce cross-examination, the lead prosecutor pointed directly to the highly calculated cleanup of the crime scene as evidence of a perfectly functioning and logical mind. He argued that a person in a snapped or confused state does not meticulously wipe a murder weapon clean, hide blood-soaked evidence in an air vent, and run a load of laundry to erase their tracks. These were not the impulses of a child who didn't understand death. They were the deliberate actions of a killer who understood exactly what he had done and how to hide it. Tensions flared even further when the defense attempted to suggest that Sarah's parenting style might have contributed to Liam's mental decline, a move that brought an immediate and thunderous response from the bench. Judge Harrison did not hesitate to shut down the defense's blatant attempt to victim blame the deceased mother, his voice echoing with a sharp moral clarity. He reminded the courtroom that the victim was not on trial, and that the court would not tolerate any further disparagement of a woman who was not there to defend herself. The heavy crack of his gavel against the wooden block resonated like a physical blow, silencing the defense attorney and restoring a sense of dignity to the proceedings. In the wake of the judge's reprimand, Liam briefly dropped his mask of sadness, casting a sharp, icy glare directly at Judge Harrison. It was a look of pure, unadulterated defiance, a silent challenge to the authority that was daring to limit his narrative. The judge, however, did not look away. He stared right back at the boy with an unfazed, steady gaze that seemed to pierce right through Liam's bravado. In that moment of silent conflict, the power dynamic in the room shifted. The defense, sensing their momentum was lost, finally rested their case. The charade was over, and it was now time for the prosecution to drop the hammer and reveal the evidence that would leave no room for doubt. The prosecutor stood slowly, the silence in the room amplifying the deliberate sound of his footsteps as he approached the center of the courtroom. He didn't begin with the graphic details of the crime scene or the visceral impact of the tragedy. Instead, he started with a cold, calculated timeline. He laid out the minutes and seconds like a surgeon, showing a sequence of events that left no room for the defense's theory of a spontaneous snap. Every movement Liam made that night was presented as a deliberate step in a premeditated plan. The prosecutor's voice was steady and devoid of theatricality, which only made the emerging picture of the boy's cold logic feel more terrifying to everyone listening. The room grew heavy as the prosecution prepared to play a series of audio recordings that would serve as the trial's most haunting evidence. First, the court heard the frantic 911 call from the neighbor, the sounds of panic and genuine concern for a friend cutting through the sterile courtroom air. Then, with a sharp transition,
The prosecutor played a voice note Liam had sent to a gaming friend during the exact same time frame. In the recording,
Liam was heard laughing and joking about a video game, his voice light and utterly unbothered. The contrast was jarring. While a neighbor feared for Sarah's life, her son was casually engaging in digital entertainment just a few feet away from the horror. This chilling juxtaposition of the mother's final moments and the son's absolute apathy became the emotional anchor of the prosecution's case. It wasn't just that Liam had committed the act. It was the way he had existed in the immediate aftermath that revealed the true depth of his detachment. The court listened to the sounds of a normal teenage life continuing as if nothing had happened, proving that to Liam, the end of his mother's life was not a moment of crisis, but a minor background event. The jurors looked from the speakers to the boy at the defense table, the reality of his character finally beginning to outweigh the smallness of his stature. For the first time since the trial began, the boy's mask of boredom and invincibility truly began to fail him. Liam stopped spinning in his leather chair, his body stiffening as the sounds of his own laughter filled the room. The realization seemed to hit him that the private world of his encrypted messages and voice notes was no longer a secret. His eyes darted toward his lawyers, looking for a way to explain away the evidence that proved he had been fully conscious and joyful while his mother lay dying. The smirk that had defined his presence in the courtroom finally faded, replaced by a look of dawning, sharp-edged realization that his digital footprints had betrayed him. The prosecution then called a forensic expert to the stand to break down the physical evidence found at the scene, specifically the blood spatter patterns in the bedroom. Using detailed diagrams, the expert proved that the killer had not acted in a blind, chaotic frenzy, but had stood over the victim in a deliberate, calculated manner. The placement of the marks suggested a cold efficiency, a series of choices made by someone who was fully aware of their surroundings. This testimony dismantled the idea that Liam was a confused child who didn't understand the gravity of his actions. It painted him instead as a focused individual who had completed a task with unsettling precision. The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch when the prosecution projected the deleted selfie onto the massive courtroom screen. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the image of Liam holding a peace sign over his mother's body filled the room. It was the ultimate visual proof of the narcissism the prosecution had been describing. Seeing the boy's calm, satisfied face in the same frame as the tragedy he had caused was more powerful than any legal argument. The jury's faces hardened as they looked at the screen, the image serving as a permanent digital testament to a level of cruelty that defied traditional explanation or any sense of youthful innocence. As the forensic expert finished his testimony, the prosecutor turned back to the jury with a look of grim satisfaction. He had shown them the timeline, the audio evidence, and the visual proof of Liam's total lack of remorse. The boy's defense was in ruins, its theories of addiction and brain development rendered hollow by the evidence of his cold, calculated actions. But the prosecution wasn't finished yet. They had one final devastating witness waiting in the wings, someone who could provide the final sickening piece of the puzzle. As the courtroom prepared for the next witness, Liam sat in total silence, his arrogance replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth. The final witness for the prosecution was called to the stand, Liam's online gaming friend, the same teenager he had bragged to on the night of the murder. The young man looked visibly nervous, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone, a stark contrast to the defendant's previous coldness. He testified with a quiet, somber tone, admitting to the court that Liam had been planning the act for weeks. He detailed conversations where Liam had expressed a deep, simmering resentment toward his mother, not because of any abuse or neglect, but because she had recently taken away his gaming console as a disciplinary measure. This revelation of the ultimate motive sent a wave of fresh horror through the courtroom. To think that a human life, the life of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her son, was taken over a grounded video game, was a motive so petty it fueled an intense, collective rage in the gallery. It wasn't a crime of passion or a complex psychological break. It was a transaction of blood for a piece of electronics. The sheer selfishness of the act was laid bare, stripping away any lingering questions about Liam's state of mind. He hadn't killed because he was broken. He had killed because he was inconvenienced. The narrator pauses here, inviting the audience to reflect on the gravity of the testimony. Was justice really served yet? The question hung in the air, emphasizing the gap between the legal proceedings and the moral weight of the crime. The motive made the tragedy feel even more senseless, highlighting the danger of a narcissism so profound that it could value a gaming console over a parent's existence. As the witness continued to speak, the eyes of the community were fixed on Liam, waiting to see if the weight of this public exposure would finally break his defiant spirit, or if he would remain a prisoner of his own ego. Suddenly, the silence of the courtroom was shattered by Liam's angry outburst. He stood up, his face red with a sudden, uncontrolled fury, and screamed at his former friend, calling him a liar in front of the judge and jury. It was the first time the court had seen the raw, unpolished version of the boy, the side that Sarah must have encountered in her final moments. This outburst wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control over a narrative that was slipping through his fingers. His ego had finally fractured under the weight of the testimony, revealing the volatile predator beneath the oversized suit. Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the room, instantly cutting through Liam's tirade and demanding absolute silence. The judge leaned forward, his expression one of cold, unwavering authority as he looked down at the teenager. "You will not speak in this room unless spoken to," he commanded, his words carrying the weight of the entire legal system. The power dynamic was unmistakable. The boy who thought he was a god in his own home was now a mere subject in a court of law. Liam slowly sat back down, his chest heaving with resentment, but he did not dare speak again as the judge's gaze held him in place. With the testimony concluded, the prosecution delivered a poetic and fiery closing argument, painting a final, indelible portrait of the defendant. The prosecutor didn't describe Liam as a child or a victim of circumstances. He painted him as an apex predator in training, someone who had learned to manipulate the world around him with cold, surgical precision. He urged the jury to look past the boy's age and see the calculation in his eyes and the blood on his hands. The argument focused on the idea that justice must be as uncompromising as the crime itself, calling for a verdict that recognized the full extent of the darkness Liam had invited into Oak Creek. The trial was now in the hands of the jury, and they were sent out to begin their deliberations in a courtroom that felt suddenly, heavily silent. The transition from the high-tension testimony to the period of waiting created an atmosphere of thick, nervous anticipation. Everyone in the gallery knew that the decision reached in the next room would define the rest of Liam's life and determine if the community would finally find some measure of closure. The wait was the final hurdle in a long, painful journey toward accountability, and the silence of the courtroom served as a temporary sanctuary for a family that had lost everything to a boy who felt nothing. Even as the jury deliberated his fate, Liam's confidence seemed to return in the quiet of the waiting period. He was seen smiling at his lawyers and casually packing up his tie, looking for all the world like someone who expected to be going home that evening. His arrogance remained his primary shield, a delusion that even the overwhelming evidence couldn't fully pierce. He whispered to his team with an air of smugness, seemingly convinced that his performance and his age would still somehow save him from the consequences of his actions. This final display of entitlement was a chilling reminder of the boy's refusal to accept reality. The wait was surprisingly short. As the courtroom buzzer sounded in record time, only 45 minutes had passed since the jury had left the room. Such a quick return usually signaled a consensus that was as swift as it was certain. The gallery held its breath as the jurors filed back into their seats, their faces solemn and unreadable. The foreperson stood up, holding the verdict forms with a steady hand as the judge asked if they had reached a decision. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a moment of finality that would either validate the prosecution's quest for justice or leave a community in a state of permanent unrest. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder," the foreperson read, the words echoing with a sharp, final clarity through the chamber. At that moment, the last of Liam's confidence evaporated instantly. His knees buckled,
and he collapsed back into his chair, the arrogance that had defined him replaced by a sudden, primal panic. The untouchable teenager was gone, replaced by a 14-year-old who finally realized that the walls of the adult world were closing in on him.
He was guilty in the eyes of the law, a verdict that ensured he would never again be the master of his own universe. The conviction was the first step, but the sentencing was where Liam's ego would truly be dismantled. While he now faced the reality of his guilt, he had yet to hear the final price he would have to pay for the life he had taken. The courtroom emptied slowly, the memory of the verdict hanging in the air like a promise kept. Liam was led away in chains, looking smaller and more pathetic than he ever had before. A boy who had sought absolute freedom only to find himself in the absolute grip of the law. The final chapter of the Oak Creek tragedy was about to be written, and the judge was preparing a conclusion that would leave no room for doubt. Weeks passed, and the changing of the seasons did nothing to thaw the chilling reality of what had occurred in Oak Creek. The final courtroom scene arrived on a morning that felt unusually cold, the air inside the chamber thick with an almost suffocating anticipation. This was not a trial of facts. The facts had already sealed the boy's fate. This was a sentencing hearing, a solemn reckoning where the emotional devastation of the crime would finally be weighed against the cold, unyielding scales of justice. Every bench was filled, every eye fixed on the empty chair at the defense table, waiting for the final act of this tragic theater to begin. When Sarah's sister took the podium to deliver her victim impact statement, a profound silence fell over the gallery. She gripped the edges of the wooden stand, her knuckles white, as she looked directly at Liam, who sat guarded and motionless. With a voice trembling with unspeakable grief, she detailed the profound, all-encompassing love Sarah had harbored for him. She painted a vivid picture of a mother who worked endlessly, whose entire existence was a monument to her son's well-being. She suggested, to the heartbreak of everyone listening, that Sarah's final act was likely an attempt to protect Liam, tragically unaware that the boy she loved was the very threat she was facing. Throughout this agonizing testament to his mother's devotion, Liam stared blankly ahead, his face a mask of impenetrable stone. He sat there, still entirely refusing to offer a single word of apology, his jaw firmly clenched in an act of silent defiance. It was a visual confirmation of everything the prosecution had argued. There was no remorse, only resentment. Turning her gaze away from the hollow shell of her nephew, the grieving aunt looked directly at the bench. With a voice that suddenly found its strength, she asked the judge for the absolute maximum penalty allowed by law. "Show him the mercy he showed my sister," she demanded, the words echoing like a definitive strike. None. All eyes in the courtroom slowly turned toward Judge Harrison, the veteran jurist who now served as the final arbiter of Liam's fate. The gravity of the moment seemed to settle heavily upon his shoulders. He adjusted his glasses slowly, peering over the rims to look down at the young boy sitting just a few feet away. The judge took a deep, centering breath, deliberately preparing to deliver a speech that would eventually go viral, a speech destined to dismantle the teenager's ego piece by piece. Judge Harrison let a long, agonizingly heavy silence hang in the room before he spoke, forcing the defendant to sit in the uncomfortable void of his own making. The judge's eyes flicked to the printout of the infamous deleted selfie resting on his desk, and then slowly back to the boy. "You sit there, young man, wrapped in the profound arrogance of youth." His voice finally boomed, rich with a stern, unwavering authority. "You thought you were smarter than the police. You truly believed you were smarter than this court." With the precision of a surgeon, the judge began systematically tearing down Liam's perceived intelligence. He highlighted the incredibly foolish, juvenile mistakes the boy had made. The arrogance of relying on a simple cloud backup, the undeniable digital footprint of the Wi-Fi logs, and the fatal assumption that a deleted photo was gone forever. He exposed Liam not as a mastermind, but as an entitled, careless child who had left a trail of evidence a mile wide. The illusion of the untouchable genius was shattered, replaced by the reality of a foolish boy who had trapped himself in a web of his own making. Under the crushing weight of this public deconstruction, for the very first time, Liam's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. He slumped forward, his chest heaving, and he began to cry, real, undeniable tears streaming down his face. But the gallery felt no sympathy. These were not tears of regret for a life stolen. They were tears of sheer, unadulterated fear for his own rapidly dissolving future. He was mourning his own lost freedom, crying for the consequences he was about to face. Judge Harrison's voice cut cleanly through the boy's sudden, dramatic sobbing. "Those tears are entirely for yourself," the judge stated firmly, refusing to offer a shred of comfort. "I have watched you throughout this trial, and I have seen absolutely no remorse for the woman who gave you life." The judge leaned forward, utilizing direct "you" language that felt like a physical weight, permanently piercing the boy's inflated ego and cornering him in the reality of his own monstrous choices. With a deliberate, practiced movement, the judge picked up the final sentencing documents. Before delivering the final blow, Judge Harrison took a moment to explain the extreme severity of trying a 14-year-old as an adult, validating the immense gravity of the decision for the historical record. He spoke of society's duty to protect itself, even from those who hide behind the face of youth. Then, he looked directly into Liam's tear-filled eyes. "I sentence you to life in prison, entirely without the possibility of parole." The words struck the boy like a physical force. Liam sprang up, his voice cracking in a desperate, primal panic. "Please," he begged, reaching his hands out toward the bench. "I'm just a kid." He invoked the very defense he had mocked just days prior, grasping for a lifeline that had already been pulled away. Judge Harrison did not flinch. He looked down at the pleading teenager and delivered a cold, unforgettable rebuttal. Children make mistakes. Monsters make calculations. With that final decree, he raised his hand. The heavy, echoing crack of the wooden gavel striking the block resonated through the chamber, the ultimate uncompromising sound of finality. The trial was over. Liam was immediately flanked by heavily armed bailiffs. He was physically dragged out of the courtroom, his legs weak, looking incredibly tiny, pathetic, and utterly broken. The grand illusion of his superiority was gone forever. Slowly, the heavy oak doors swung shut, and the courtroom began to empty, leaving only the quiet, lingering memory of justice finally being served. In the months that followed, Oak Creek slowly began to heal. The quiet suburban house where the tragedy unfolded was quietly sold, and a beautiful memorial garden was planted in the community park to honor Sarah's endless compassion. The neighborhood returned to its peaceful rhythm, forever changed, but moving forward. Meanwhile, miles away, the narrative offered a brief, sobering flash to Liam's bleak new reality. He was entirely stripped of his branded clothes, his video games, and his phone. He was left with nothing but concrete walls and steel bars for the next 60 years of his life. The poetic justice of the situation was absolute, a perfect fulfillment of the story's core moral rule. He had started this dark journey taking a life with absolute, unchecked arrogance, and he ended it begging for his own life in total, humiliating submission. He had spent weeks thinking he would never be caught, but the universe had a different plan. Now, he will never be free. This tragedy forces us to reflect deeply on the terrifying darkness that can sometimes hide behind a seemingly innocent child's smile, and it reminds us of the uncompromising, necessary weight of the law. We are reminded that actions, no matter who commits them, carry consequences that cannot be outsmarted or deleted. If you think justice was rightfully served today, make sure others see this story too. The smirk that haunted a courtroom disappeared forever. The gavel fell, and the boy who thought he was a god learned the hardest lesson of all. He was nothing but a prisoner. The sentencing of Liam was more than just a legal conclusion. It was the beginning of a long, painful reckoning for the community of Oak Creek. In the weeks following the final crack of Judge Harrison's gavel, the neighborhood struggled to reconcile the image of the manicured lawns and unlocked doors with the darkness that had unfolded in their midst. The house where Sarah had poured her life into her son's future became a silent monument to a broken dream, eventually sold to a family who knew nothing of the metallic scent that had once hung in the air.
A memorial garden was established in the local park, filled with the types of vibrant flowers Sarah used to tend to, serving as a living testament to a woman whose final moments were spent in the service of a love that was never returned. While the physical scars of the neighborhood began to fade, the psychological impact on the residents remained profound and deeply unsettling. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now found themselves double-checking locks and looking at their own teenagers with a new, unwelcome sense of scrutiny. The story of the boy with the child's face and the predator's mind became a cautionary tale whispered in the aisles of the local grocery store and at PTA meetings.
Oak Creek had lost its innocence, replaced by a collective understanding that the most dangerous threats aren't always lurking in the shadows outside. Sometimes they are sitting right across from you at the dinner table, smiling while they plan your demise. Inside the sterile, high-security facility where Liam was transferred to begin his life sentence, the reality of his new existence began to set in with a cold, mechanical finality. Gone were the high-end gaming consoles, the private schooling, and the comforts of a mother's devotion that he had treated with such callous indifference. He was now just a number in a system designed to contain those who have proven themselves incompatible with a civilized society. The concrete and steel of his surroundings offered no luxury and no audience for his narcissism, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own thoughts for the next 60 years. The absolute freedom he had killed to achieve had turned into the most rigid form of captivity imaginable. The investigation into Liam's digital life didn't end with his conviction. Instead, it opened a disturbing window into the online subculture that had sheltered his growing resentment. Authorities began a deep dive into the Discord servers where Liam had spent his hours, looking for others who might have encouraged his dark trajectory. What they found was a community of young men who traded in irony and detachment, where talk of violence was often treated as a game or a joke. This digital fallout raised uncomfortable questions about the role of online anonymity in fueling the types of malignant narcissism that Liam displayed. It was clear that while Liam held the knife, the culture he inhabited had provided the ideological whetstone. For the friends Liam had bragged to, the weight of their silence became a burden that many would carry for the rest of their lives. The testimony of the gaming friend who had finally come forward served as a chilling reminder of how easily the signs of a coming tragedy can be dismissed as edgy online posturing. These teenagers were forced to confront the reality that their digital interactions had real-world consequences, and that a life had been taken over a motive as petty as a grounded console. The prosecution had painted Liam as an apex predator, but the aftermath revealed a network of enablers who had watched the predator grow in the safety of a chat room, never realizing the beast would eventually strike. Sarah's sister and the rest of the extended family found themselves navigating a new normal that was defined by a gaping, Sarah-shaped hole in their lives. The catharsis of the trial offered a measure of justice, but it could not replace the phone calls, the shared meals, or the sound of Sarah's laughter. They worked to ensure that Liam's name was eventually forgotten, while Sarah's legacy of pediatric care and kindness was celebrated and preserved. They became advocates for victims of domestic and juvenile violence, turning their private grief into a public mission to ensure that no other family would have to stand in a courtroom and watch a child smirk at the memory of a murdered parent. The legal legacy of the Liam case rippled through the state's judicial system, sparking intense debates about the age of criminal responsibility and the ethics of sentencing minors to life without parole. Legal experts and child psychologists scrutinized every aspect of the trial, from Liam's steady heart rate to the chilling selfie over the body. The case became a benchmark for how the law handles monsters who make calculations, rather than children who make mistakes. It served as a grim reminder that when the crime is absolute, the punishment must be equally uncompromising, regardless of the defendant's age or the soft features of their face. Ultimately, the story of the 15-year-old killer who thought he was untouchable remains a haunting exploration of the limits of human empathy. Liam's journey from a suburban bedroom to a maximum security cell is a study in the destructive power of narcissism and the inevitable weight of accountability. He thought he could delete his past and script his own future, but the hidden audio and the digital footprints ensured that the truth would always have the final word. The boy who wanted to be a god learned that in the eyes of justice, he was nothing more than a prisoner of his own choices, forever haunted by the smirk that finally and permanently disappeared.